The Monkey's Paw. On a cold, wet night, as the wind howled outside and the rain tapped against the windows, the White family sat together in their small but cozy parlor. The fire burned warmly, its flickering glow chasing away the gloom that pressed against the walls of the house. Mr. White and his son Herbert played a quiet game of chess, while Mrs. White knitted by the fire, occasionally glancing up at her husband's frustrated face as he made yet another foolish move in the game. The night felt ordinary, safe, and even comforting. But as the clock ticked and the storm grew heavier, an unseen fate was drawing closer to their door. After a final victorious move by Herbert, the father muttered in irritation and looked toward the door. "Hark at the wind," he said suddenly. "I'm sure we'll have a visitor before long." And he was right. A knock echoed against the wood, firm and deliberate, carrying a weight that silenced their laughter. Mr. White opened the door, and there stood Sergeant Major Morris, an old family friend, a soldier whose face carried the marks of distant lands and strange experiences. He entered with a gust of cold air, stamping the rain from his boots. They offered him a seat near the fire, poured him a glass, and soon he was telling stories of his adventures in India, stories of heat and noise, of temples and gods, of strange rites and customs. Herbert listened with bright eyes, while Mr. and Mrs. White leaned forward eagerly. But then Sergeant Major Morris spoke of something that hushed their excitement. From his pocket, he drew out a small, withered object, a monkey's paw, dried and mummified, twisted in an unnatural shape. "What's that?" asked Mrs. White, her knitting needles frozen in her hands. "A charm," said the soldier slowly, "an old talisman. This paw had a spell put on it by a fakir, a holy man. He wanted to prove that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who tried to change it would do so to their sorrow." They stared at the grotesque little paw. It looked harmless enough, yet Morris's grave tone made it seem as if it carried a weight far heavier than its size. "It grants 3 wishes, the sergeant continued. 3 wishes to 3 separate men. But let me warn you, those wishes come at a price. A terrible price." Mr. White chuckled nervously. "Sounds like something from a fairy tale." But Morris shook his head. "I was the 3rd owner. The first 2 had their stories. I cannot tell you what the first man wished for, but his last wish was for death. As for the second, I don't speak of it." He tossed the paw into the fire. "Best to let it burn." But Mr. White, half curious and half foolish, snatched it from the flames. "If it's so dangerous, why do you keep it?" he asked. Morris fixed him with a stern gaze. "Because it is part of my story now. But if you choose to keep it, don't blame me for what follows. Wish for something sensible, if you must wish at all." After he left, the Whites sat in uneasy silence. Herbert laughed first, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, father, why don't you wish for something grand? A palace, a king's ransom?" But Mr. White only smiled. "Our lives are simple enough. But perhaps £200 to pay off the house would do no harm." He held the paw up and spoke aloud, "I wish for £200. The paw twisted in his hand, writhing like a snake, and Mr. White cried out, dropping it to the floor. A hush fell over the room. The fire crackled, the wind moaned, but nothing else happened. Herbert laughed again. "I don't see the money. Perhaps it will drop from the sky onto your head." The family laughed nervously and went to bed, trying to dismiss the unease that clung to their thoughts. The next morning was bright, and Herbert left for work, joking about the monkey's paw. But as the day wore on, a knock came at the door. Mr. and Mrs. White answered, only to find a well-dressed man standing solemnly, hat in hand. His words were heavy with sorrow. Herbert had been killed in an accident at the factory. Mrs. White screamed and collapsed. Mr. White stood frozen, his heart breaking. The man went on, almost whispering. The company wished to extend their deepest sympathies. As compensation for their loss, they would receive £200. The exact sum Mr. White had wished for. For days, the house was filled with grief. Mrs. White wept constantly, while her husband sat in silence, the monkey's paw lying in the corner, cursed and yet irresistible. One night, Mrs. White's tear-stained face turned toward her husband with a sudden, desperate idea. "The paw," she whispered. "We still have 2 wishes left. We can bring him back." We can bring Herbert back. Mr. White trembled. He's been dead for 10 days, buried. But she clutched his arm, her eyes blazing. Wish it. Wish for my boy again. Torn between love and horror, Mr. White raised the paw, his hand shaking violently. I wish my son alive again. The wind outside howled louder, the house groaned, and silence fell. They waited. Then, from the darkness beyond their door, came a sound. A slow, heavy knock. Mrs. White cried out in joy. It's him! It's Herbert! My boy! She rushed to the door, fumbling with the locks. But Mr. White's face was pale with terror. He knew the truth. Herbert had not died peacefully, his body had been mangled beyond recognition in the factory machinery. What was returning to them now was not their son as they remembered him, but something broken, something unnatural. The knocking grew louder, insistent, shaking the very door. Mrs. White pulled at the bolts, desperate to let her son in. I must open it. He needs me. But Mr. White, with a cry of despair, groped for the monkey's paw. He clutched it tightly and made his final wish. I wish for it to end. The paw writhed one last time, and then fell still. The knocking stopped. Mrs. White flung the door open wide. The night was silent. The road was empty. There was no one there. Only the wind, whispering through the trees, as if mocking the sorrow of the Whites. And in the parlor, the monkey's paw lay on the floor, its 3 wishes spent.